The sun was barely showing its face when old Raman slowly got up from his thin mattress on the floor. His bones creaked like old wood, and every morning felt harder than the last. At 72 years old, his body wasn't what it used to be, but his spirit remained strong. He had work to do. Raman lived in a small house at the edge of the city with his wife Sita, who had been sick for many months. The walls were cracked, the roof leaked when it rained, but it was home. Behind their tiny house sat his workshop, really just 4 walls and a roof where he made his clay pots. This little space had been his world for over 40 years. As he stepped outside, the cool morning air hit his face. He loved this time of day when the world was quiet and peaceful. The birds were just starting to sing, and the busy sounds of the city hadn't started yet. This was his time to think and prepare for another day of work. Walking to his workshop, Raman looked at the rows of clay pots he had made yesterday. Big ones, small ones, water pots, flower pots, cooking pots, each one shaped by his own hands. His fingers were permanently stained brown from the clay, and no amount of washing could make them clean anymore. But he didn't mind. These stains were proof of his hard work. Every pot told a story. He would sit at his potter's wheel, take a lump of wet clay, and slowly shape it into something useful. Sometimes he would make water pots for families who needed to store drinking water. Other times he made cooking pots for mothers who wanted to make tasty food for their children. Each pot was made with care and love. Raman's back ached as he bent down to load his bicycle cart. This old bicycle had been with him for 15 years. It squeaked and wobbled, but it still worked. He carefully placed each pot in the cart, wrapping the delicate ones in old newspapers so they wouldn't break during the bumpy ride to the market. As he worked, he thought about his life. When he was young, pottery was a respected skill. People would come to his father's workshop and wait patiently for their orders. His father had taught him everything: how to prepare the clay, how to center it on the wheel, how to pull up the walls of a pot with just the right pressure. Pottery is not just about making pots, his father used to say. It's about understanding the clay, respecting it, and working with it, not against it. But times had changed. Now people bought cheap plastic containers from shops. They were lighter, didn't break easily, and came in bright colors. Clay pots were becoming old-fashioned. Still, some people appreciated the traditional way. They knew that water tasted better when stored in clay pots, and food cooked in clay containers had a special flavor that plastic could never give. Loading his cart took almost an hour. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and he had to be extra careful. One dropped pot meant losing money his family desperately needed. When everything was secure, he pushed the heavy cart out of his workshop and began the long journey to the market. The ride to the marketplace took 30 minutes on his old bicycle. The cart was so heavy that he had to get off and push it up the small hills. Cars and buses rushed past him, their engines making loud noises and filling the air with smoke. Sometimes drivers would honk at him impatiently, wanting him to move faster. But Raman couldn't go any faster. He was doing his best. As he pedaled slowly through the streets, he saw the city changing around him. New buildings were going up everywhere. Shopping malls with glass fronts and bright signs were replacing the old shops where he used to buy his clay and other supplies. Even the roads were different, wider and smoother, but somehow less friendly than the narrow streets he remembered from his youth. When Raman finally reached the marketplace, it was already becoming busy. Other vendors were setting up their stalls, shopkeepers were opening their stores, and early customers were starting to walk around looking for good deals. He had been coming to this same spot for over 20 years. It wasn't official. He didn't have a proper shop or stall, but everyone knew this was Raman's place. He spread out his old blanket on the ground and began arranging his pots. The big water pots went in the back, the smaller ones in front. He organized them by size and type, making sure each one could be seen clearly. This was important because customers liked to see what they were buying. As he worked, other vendors greeted him. There was Kumari, the flower seller, who had been coming here almost as long as he had. She sold beautiful garlands and loose flowers for temples and weddings. Next to her was old Babu, who repaired shoes and sandals. Across the way, Mira sold vegetables she grew in her small garden outside the city. All of them were like Raman, simple people trying to make an honest living. They didn't have fancy shops or rich families to support them. They worked with their hands, sold what they could, and hoped to make enough money each day to buy food and pay for medicines when they got sick. The morning customers started coming around 8 o'clock. First came the domestic helpers who worked in big houses. They would buy water pots for their employers or cooking pots for themselves. Raman always gave them good prices because he knew they didn't earn much money. Then came the housewives doing their morning shopping. Some of them had been buying from Raman for years. They trusted his work and knew that his pots would last a long time. Mrs. Sharma, who lived nearby, had been using one of his water pots for over 10 years. "Your pots never break," she would tell her friends. "And the water stays cool even on the hottest days." But selling wasn't easy anymore. Many customers would look at his pots, touch them, ask about prices, but then walk away without buying anything. "Too heavy," some would say. "I prefer plastic," others would comment. It hurt when people dismissed his life's work so easily, but Raman never showed his disappointment. He would just smile and say, "Maybe next time." Around noon, when the sun was getting hot, Raman would eat his simple lunch. Sita would pack 2 rotis with some pickle in an old cloth bag. He would eat slowly, watching the busy marketplace around him. Sometimes, if he had made a few sales, he would buy a glass of sweet tea from the tea seller. These small pleasures made the long day a little easier. The afternoon was usually the hardest time. The sun would beat down on him, and fewer customers would come. Many of the other vendors would rest in whatever shade they could find, but Raman stayed with his pots. He couldn't risk someone taking them or a customer coming and not finding him there. During these quiet hours, he would often think about his children. His son worked in a factory in Mumbai and sent some money home when he could. His daughter was married and lived in another city with her husband's family. They were good children, but they had their own problems and expenses. Raman understood this and never complained, but sometimes he felt very alone. As evening approached, Raman would start packing up his unsold pots. On a good day, he might sell 5 or 6 pieces. On a bad day, maybe only 1 or 2. The money wasn't much, sometimes barely enough to buy rice and vegetables for dinner, but it was honest work, and Raman had never asked anyone for charity in his entire life. Loading the cart again was always difficult after a long day. His back would ache more, his legs would feel tired, and his hands would be sore from handling clay all day. But he would carefully wrap each unsold pot and place it back in the cart. These pots would come back with him tomorrow, and maybe tomorrow someone would need them. The ride home was peaceful but tiring. The evening traffic was heavy, and drivers seemed more impatient than in the morning. But Raman had learned to be patient. He would ride slowly, keeping to the side of the road, and let everyone else rush past him. When he finally reached home, Sita would be waiting for him. She would ask about his day, how many pots he sold, what customers said. Even though she was sick, she always worried about their daily income. Raman would tell her about the good parts of his day and keep the disappointing parts to himself. After dinner, which was usually simple rice with vegetables and maybe a small piece of fish if he had sold well that day, Raman would go to his workshop. Even though he was tired, he would spend an hour or 2 making new pots. The clay felt good in his hands, and the rhythmic motion of the potter's wheel helped him relax after a long day. As he worked in the dim light of his single bulb, Raman would think about tomorrow. Maybe it would be a better day. Maybe more customers would appreciate his work. Maybe someone would need exactly the kind of pot he made best. These hopes kept him going day after day, year after year. Before going to bed, he would look at his hands in the lamplight. They were old hands now, wrinkled and stained, with fingers that sometimes trembled. But they were skilled hands. Hands that could create something beautiful and useful from a simple lump of clay. His father had hands like these, and his grandfather before him. It was a proud tradition, even if the world didn't always appreciate it anymore. Lying on his thin mattress, listening to Sita's difficult breathing beside him, Raman would pray for strength to continue another day. He never asked for riches or an easy life. He only asked for enough health to keep working and enough customers to keep his small family fed. Little did he know that tomorrow would bring a challenge unlike any he had faced before, one that would test not only his resolve, but also reveal the kindness that still existed in unexpected places. The next morning started like any other, but there was something different in the air. As Raman pushed his cart through the streets toward the marketplace, he noticed more police vehicles than usual. Their white cars with flashing lights were parked at different corners, and officers in crisp uniforms were walking around talking to shop owners and vendors. "What's happening?" Raman asked Kumari, the flower seller, as he set up his pots in their usual spot. "Haven't you heard?" She whispered, looking worried. "There's a new police inspector in charge of this area. They say he's very strict about rules and regulations. He wants to make the marketplace clean and organized." Raman felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. Over the years, he had dealt with various officials who saw street vendors like him as problems to be solved, rather than people trying to make an honest living. Some had been understanding, others had made life difficult. He hoped this new inspector would be one of the reasonable ones. As the morning progressed, word spread quickly among the vendors about the new inspector. His name was Arjun Singh, and he had a reputation for being tough but fair. Some said he had cleaned up several other markets in the city, forcing out illegal vendors and making everything more organized. Others whispered that he showed no mercy to anyone who didn't follow the rules exactly. "I heard he made all the vendors in Sector 15 get proper licenses," said Babu, the shoe repairman, "and those who couldn't get licenses had to leave." "But we've been here for years," said Mira, the vegetable seller. "This has always been our place. Our customers know where to find us." Raman listened to all the gossip, but tried to focus on his work. He had been selling pots here for over 20 years. Surely that counted for something. He had never caused any trouble, never fought with other vendors, never blocked the road unnecessarily. He was just an old man trying to feed his family. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, a police jeep stopped near the marketplace. Raman watched as a tall, well-built man in a perfectly pressed uniform got out. Even from a distance, it was clear that this man commanded respect. His posture was straight, his walk was confident, and other police officers immediately gathered around him for instructions. This had to be Inspector Arjun Singh. The inspector began walking through the marketplace, his sharp eyes taking in everything. He stopped at various stalls, asking questions, checking papers, making notes in a small book he carried. Some vendors looked nervous, fumbling through their bags to find whatever documents they had. Others tried to appear busy, hoping he wouldn't stop at their stalls. Raman tried to stay calm, but his hands were shaking slightly as he arranged his pots. He had some papers, an old permit that had been issued years ago by the previous local administration, and a receipt showing he paid a small fee to the market association. He wasn't sure if these papers were still valid, but they were all he had. As Inspector Singh moved closer to his section of the market, Raman could hear parts of his conversations with other vendors. His voice was firm, but not cruel. He seemed to be explaining new rules about licenses, proper stall arrangements, and cleanliness standards. Some vendors were nodding and agreeing, while others looked confused or worried. Then it happened. Inspector Singh stopped directly in front of Raman's display of clay pots. For a moment, neither man spoke. The inspector looked down at the elderly potter, taking in his simple clothes, his stained hands, and his modest collection of handmade pottery. Raman looked up at the tall officer, trying to read his expression behind the official sternness. "Good morning, uncle," the inspector said, using the respectful term for an elderly man. His voice was polite but businesslike. "How long have you been selling here?" "Many years, sir," Raman replied softly. "More than 20 years. I make these pots myself in my workshop." Inspector Singh nodded and looked more closely at the pottery. He picked up a medium-sized water pot and examined it carefully, turning it around in his hands. "Nice work," he commented. "You made all of these yourself?" "Yes, sir, every single one. I learned from my father and he learned from his father. It's our family tradition." "Do you have proper permission to sell here?" the inspector asked, setting the pot down gently. This was the question Raman had been dreading. He reached into his old cloth bag with trembling fingers and pulled out his papers. "I have this permit, sir, and this receipt from the Market Association." Inspector Singh took the papers and examined them carefully. Raman watched his face, trying to guess what he was thinking. The permit was old and somewhat faded. The official stamp was from an administration that no longer existed. The receipt was more recent, but it wasn't really an official government document. After what seemed like several minutes but was probably only 30 seconds, Inspector Singh handed the papers back. "Uncle, I'm sorry, but these documents are no longer valid. The old permit system has been replaced and this receipt doesn't count as official permission." Raman's heart sank. He had expected this, but hearing it still felt like a blow to his chest. "What should I do, sir? This is my only source of income. My wife is sick and we need money for her medicines." The inspector's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained official. "You need to apply for a new vendor's license, through the proper channels. Until then, I'm afraid you cannot sell here." "But sir," Raman said, his voice becoming desperate, "I don't know about these new procedures. I don't know how to apply for new licenses. I'm just an old man who makes pots." Inspector Singh looked around at the other vendors who had stopped their work to listen to this conversation. He knew that many of them were in similar situations, honest people who had been working here for years without proper paperwork, simply because the system had been different when they started. "The rules are the same for everyone," he said loudly enough for others to hear. "This marketplace is being modernized. We need proper organization, proper licenses, proper hygiene standards. There's no room for unauthorized vendors." Raman felt tears forming in his eyes, but he tried not to let them show. "Sir, please give me some time. Let me find out about these new licenses. Don't make me leave today." But Inspector Singh had already made up his mind. "I'm sorry, Uncle. You need to pack up your things and leave immediately. If you don't, I'll have to confiscate your goods, and you could face legal action." The words hit Raman like physical blows. Legal action? Confiscation? These were terrifying concepts for an old man who had never been in trouble with the law in his entire life. His hands began shaking more noticeably as he started to understand that this was really happening. "Please, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "These pots represent many days of work. If you take them away, my family will have nothing to eat tonight." But Inspector Singh had already turned his attention to the next vendor. His job was to enforce the law, not to solve every individual's personal problems. He had been given clear instructions to clean up the marketplace, and that's exactly what he intended to do. Raman began the heartbreaking task of packing up his pots. His movements were slow and clumsy because his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Other vendors watched sympathetically, but no one dared to interfere with a police inspector's orders. They were all afraid of being next. As he lifted a large water pot, Raman's grip slipped. The pot fell from his hands and crashed onto the concrete pavement, breaking into several large pieces. The sound of breaking clay echoed through the marketplace, and everything seemed to go quiet for a moment. Raman stared at the broken pieces. That pot had taken him 3 hours to make. It would have sold for enough money to buy vegetables for 3 days. Now it was just useless fragments on the ground. He knelt down slowly and began picking up the pieces with the same careful attention he had used to create them. Even broken, he couldn't bear to just leave them there. Maybe he could use the clay again, he thought. Maybe he could fix it somehow. Inspector Singh had moved on to question other vendors, but he could hear the sound of the breaking pot and the old man's quiet movements behind him. Something about the way Raman was handling even the broken pieces, with such gentle care, as if they were still precious, made the inspector pause in his conversation with the next vendor. Other customers in the marketplace had also stopped to watch. Some felt sorry for the old man, but most were afraid to show any sympathy openly. Nobody wanted to anger the strict new inspector on his first day of enforcement. As Raman continued collecting the broken pieces, wrapping them carefully in a cloth, Inspector Singh found himself thinking about his own grandfather. The old man had been a carpenter in a small village, working with his hands just like this potter. He had died when Singh was young, but he remembered how proud his grandfather had been of his craft, how he had treated even the smallest piece of wood with respect. But duty was duty. Inspector Singh had been sent here to bring order to chaos, to make the marketplace comply with modern regulations. He couldn't make exceptions for every sad story he encountered. If he started showing sympathy to one unauthorized vendor, word would spread, and soon everyone would expect special treatment. Still, as he watched Raman slowly load his remaining pots back onto his bicycle cart, the inspector felt an uncomfortable feeling in his chest. Inspector Arjun Singh continued his rounds through the marketplace, checking documents and explaining the new regulations to other vendors. But somehow, his mind kept drifting back to the old potter. There had been something in the man's quiet dignity that stuck with him, like a small stone in his shoe that he couldn't ignore. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of official duties. Some vendors had proper paperwork, others didn't. A few argued and complained loudly about the new rules while others accepted them quietly. But none of them affected Singh the way the old man had. Maybe it was because Raman hadn't argued or made a scene. He had simply accepted his fate with a grace that was both admirable and heartbreaking. Around noon, Inspector Singh decided to take a break from his enforcement duties. The marketplace was getting crowded with the lunchtime rush, and he needed some time to think. He walked to a small tea stall at the edge of the market area and ordered a glass of chai. As he sipped his tea, he found himself listening to the conversations around him. Two women were discussing their morning shopping, and one of them mentioned the potter. "Did you see what happened to old Raman?" the first woman asked. The new inspector made him pack up and leave. "Really? But I've been buying water pots from him for 5 years. His pots are the best in the whole market. They keep water cool even in summer, and they never crack like those cheap ones from the shops." "I know. My mother-in-law swears by his cooking pots. She says food tastes better when it's cooked in his clay pots than in those metal ones. Where will we buy good pottery now? Those factory-made pots break so easily, and they're not good for health like clay pots are." Inspector Singh tried to focus on his tea, but more conversations reached his ears. "Poor old man," said a shopkeeper to his customer. "He's been coming here since before my father opened this shop. Never caused any trouble, never fought with anyone. Always gave good prices to poor customers." "I heard his wife is very sick." The customer replied, "How will they manage now? At his age, what other work can he do?" "Remember last summer during the heat wave? He gave free water pots to 3 families who couldn't afford them. Said nobody should have to drink warm water in such terrible heat." These conversations made Inspector Singh feel increasingly uncomfortable. He had pictured Raman as just another unauthorized vendor cluttering up the marketplace. But clearly, this old man was more than that to the people here. He was part of their community, someone they trusted and respected. Singh finished his tea quickly and decided to walk around the market some more. But everywhere he went, he heard more stories about the potter. The flower seller, Kumari, was telling a customer about how Raman had made special small pots for her to use as planters for her delicate flowers. The shoe repair man mentioned how Raman had never charged him full price because he knew shoe repair didn't earn much money. "He's a good man," Babu said to anyone who would listen. "In 40 years of working in this market, I've never seen him cheat a customer or be rude to anyone. He treats everyone with respect, whether they're buying expensive pots or just asking for directions." By mid-afternoon, Inspector Singh realized that removing Raman had created a void in the marketplace that went beyond just losing one more vendor. The old potter wasn't just selling pots. He was providing something the community valued and couldn't easily replace. Singh tried to push these thoughts out of his mind. He had a job to do, and that job was to enforce the law equally for everyone. He couldn't start making exceptions based on how well-liked someone was or how long they had been working somewhere. That would lead to chaos and unfairness. But as evening approached, Inspector Singh found himself thinking about his own family. His grandfather, who had been a village carpenter, had often talked about the satisfaction of creating something useful with his own hands. "When you make something yourself," the old man used to say, "you put part of your soul into it. That's why handmade things last longer and work better than factory-made things." Singh remembered visiting his grandfather's workshop as a child, watching the old man carefully select pieces of wood, measuring and cutting with precision, fitting pieces together to create chairs, tables, and cabinets that would last for generations. There was something almost magical about watching raw materials transform into useful objects through skill and patience. Raman's pottery was probably like that too. Each pot shaped by hand, fired with care, created to serve a specific purpose. The factory-made pots that filled the shops might be cheaper and more convenient, but they lacked the soul that came from individual craftsmanship. As Singh walked back to the police station that evening, he passed by the spot where Raman used to sit. The space looked empty now, just a patch of concrete like any other. But during the day, it had been alive with activity. Customers examining pots, children watching the old man arrange his wares, people stopping to chat and share news. That night, Inspector Singh had trouble sleeping. He kept thinking about the moment when Raman's pot had slipped and broken on the concrete. The old man hadn't cursed or gotten angry. He hadn't blamed anyone or complained about his bad luck. He had simply knelt down and carefully collected every piece, treating even the broken fragments with the same respect he showed his perfect pots. There was something profoundly moving about that scene. In a world where people often became angry over small disappointments, here was a man who faced a significant loss with quiet dignity. It spoke of a character that had been shaped by years of dealing with hardship without losing his humanity. Singh also couldn't stop thinking about what would happen to Raman now. At 72 years old, with a sick wife and limited options, where would the old man find another source of income? The new license procedures were complicated and expensive. Even if Raman could figure out how to apply, it might take months to get approval. What would his family eat in the meantime? The next morning, Inspector Singh decided to drive by Raman's neighborhood before starting his official duties. He wasn't sure why he felt compelled to do this, but something was drawing him to see how the old potter lived when he wasn't at the marketplace. The address wasn't hard to find. Singh asked a few people in the area, and everyone knew where the potter lived. They all spoke of him with the same respect and affection that the market customers had shown. When Singh found the small house, he parked his jeep across the street and observed quietly. The building was old and modest, with cracked walls and a roof that had seen better days. Behind the house, he could see a small workshop with piles of clay and several pottery wheels. As he watched, Raman emerged from the workshop carrying a large water pot. Even from a distance, Singh could see that the old man moved slowly and carefully, his back bent from years of physical labor. He placed the pot with several others that were drying in the morning sun. Then something unexpected happened. A woman with 2 small children approached Raman's house. She looked poor. Her sari was faded and patched, and the children's clothes were too big for them. Singh watched as she spoke to Raman, gesturing toward the pots. Raman nodded and selected a medium-sized water pot. He handed it to the woman, but when she reached into her bag for money, he waved his hand and shook his head. He was giving her the pot for free. The woman tried to insist on paying, but Raman was firm in his refusal. Singh could see her gratitude, even from across the street, as she thanked the old man repeatedly before leaving with her children and the free pot. This scene was repeated twice more while Singh watched. Another poor woman came for a cooking pot, and an elderly man needed a container for storing grain. In both cases, Raman gave them what they needed without accepting payment. Inspector Singh realized he was witnessing something remarkable. Here was a man who had just lost his main source of income, who had been publicly humiliated and forced to leave his workplace. Yet he was still giving away his products to people who needed them more than he did. Singh thought about the pots Raman had given away that morning. Each one represented hours of work, preparing the clay, shaping it on the wheel, letting it dry, firing it in the kiln. In terms of time and effort, those free pots were worth at least a full day's labor. Yet Raman had given them away without hesitation to people who couldn't afford to pay. This was not the behavior of someone trying to circumvent the law or cheat the system. This was the behavior of someone who genuinely cared about his community and saw his work as a service to others. not just a way to make money. As Singh watched Raman slowly make his way back to the workshop, the old man suddenly looked up and noticed the police jeep across the street. For a moment, their eyes met through the windshield. Raman's expression showed no fear or anger, just a mild curiosity about why a police officer was parked outside his home. Singh felt a sudden urge to get out of the jeep and talk to the old man. But what would he say? That he was sorry for enforcing the law? That he wished things could be different? That he was beginning to question whether his understanding of order and progress was too narrow? Instead, he started the engine and drove away. But as he headed back toward the marketplace, Singh carried with him a new understanding of the man whose livelihood he had disrupted. Raman wasn't just an unauthorized vendor who needed to be removed for the sake of... Inspector Arjun Singh barely slept that second night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Raman's face, the quiet acceptance, the gentle way he had handled even the broken pieces of his pot, the dignity with which he had faced public humiliation. By morning, Singh had made up his mind about what he needed to do. Instead of going straight to the marketplace, he first drove to the municipal office where vendor licenses were processed. The clerk behind the counter looked surprised to see a police inspector asking about licensing procedures, but he was eager to help. The process usually takes 6 to 8 weeks, the clerk explained, shuffling through a stack of forms. First, there's an application fee of 2,000 rupees. Then we need proof of residence, identity documents, a no-objection certificate from the local market association, and a clearance from the health department. Singh looked at the pile of papers and forms. For an educated person with time and money, this might be manageable. But for an elderly man like Raman, who probably had limited literacy and very little money, these requirements would be nearly impossible to meet. "Is there any way to speed up the process for special cases?" Singh asked. The clerk shrugged. "Sometimes, if a high-ranking official makes a special request, we can fast-track an application. But it still takes at least 2 weeks, and all the fees and documents are still required." Singh spent the rest of the morning learning about the licensing system. He discovered that it had been designed with good intentions, to bring order to the chaotic street vendor situation and ensure that sellers met basic health and safety standards. But in practice, the system was so complex and expensive that it effectively excluded the very people it was supposed to regulate. Most of the successful applicants were educated shop owners who wanted to expand their businesses onto the streets, or people with enough money to pay agents to handle the paperwork for them. Traditional vendors like Raman, who had been working honestly for decades, were being pushed out by their own lack of education and resources. By noon, Inspector Singh had formulated a plan. It wasn't entirely according to the rules, but sometimes the spirit of the law was more important than the letter of the law. He drove back to the marketplace with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. When he arrived at the market, word spread quickly among the vendors that the strict inspector was back. Some of them tensed up, expecting more enforcement actions. Others tried to look busy, hoping to avoid his attention, but Singh wasn't there for enforcement today. He walked directly to the spot where Raman used to sit, which was now occupied by a woman selling cheap plastic containers and imported goods. The contrast was stark. Where once there had been beautiful handcrafted clay pots, there was now a display of mass-produced items that looked identical to products available in any shop. "Excuse me," Singh said to the woman. "Are you authorized to sell here?" She fumbled through her bag and produced a temporary permit that allowed her to use the space for 1 week while applying for a permanent license. Her papers were in order, but Singh noticed that several customers had approached her stall, looked at her products, and walked away disappointed. "Where is the potter who used to sit here?" one elderly customer asked another vendor. "I need a good water pot, and his were the best. The police made him leave," came the reply. "Now we have to buy those cheap pots from the shops that break after a few months." Singh heard these conversations and felt more convinced that he was doing the right thing. He walked back to his jeep and drove toward Raman's neighborhood. This time, instead of just observing from across the street, Inspector Singh parked his jeep and walked directly to Raman's house. The old potter was in his workshop, slowly shaping a small pot on his wheel. His movements were precise and graceful, despite his age, and Singh could see the decades of experience in every motion. When Raman noticed the police inspector approaching his workshop, he stopped the wheel and stood up slowly. His face showed concern but not fear. He wiped his clay-stained hands on an old cloth and waited respectfully for Singh to speak. "Good afternoon, Uncle," Singh said, using the same respectful term he had used at their first meeting. "May I speak with you for a few minutes?" "Of course, sir," Raman replied, gesturing toward a simple wooden chair. "Please sit. Can I offer you some tea?" The offer of hospitality, even from someone who had every reason to be angry with him, touched Singh deeply. "No, thank you, Uncle. I wanted to talk to you about returning to the marketplace." Raman's eyes widened slightly, but he remained cautious. "Sir, you told me I needed proper licenses. I don't know how to get them, and I don't have money for fees and agents." "I know," Singh said gently. "That's why I'm here. I want to help you get the license you need." For several seconds, Raman stared at the inspector in disbelief. "Sir, I don't understand. Why would you help me? Yesterday you made me leave." Singh took a deep breath. How could he explain the transformation that had taken place in his heart over the past 2 days? How could he describe the way Raman's quiet dignity had challenged everything he thought he knew about law enforcement? "Uncle," he began slowly, "yesterday I was doing my job the way I thought it should be done. I was focused on rules and regulations, on making the marketplace look organized and modern. But after I saw you leave, I started thinking about what we lost when we removed you from that space." Raman listened carefully, still not quite believing what he was hearing. "I spent some time learning about your work," Singh continued. "I heard people talking about the quality of your pots, about how you help customers who can't afford to pay full price, about how you've been part of that community for over 20 years. I realized that when I made you leave, I wasn't just enforcing a regulation. I was breaking something valuable." Singh paused, looking around the modest workshop. "I also watched you yesterday morning giving free pots to people who needed them. Even after losing your income, you were still taking care of others. That taught me something about what really matters." Raman's eyes filled with tears, but he remained silent, afraid that if he spoke, this unexpected kindness might disappear. "I want to help you get a proper license," Singh said firmly. "I'll handle the paperwork, pay the fees, and make sure everything is processed quickly. But more than that, I want to apologize for the way I treated you yesterday. You deserved better." "Sir," Raman said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I never expected this. I thought you were just doing your job." "I was doing my job," Singh replied, "but I wasn't doing it well. A good police officer doesn't just enforce laws blindly. He tries to understand the people he serves and find ways to help them follow the law while still maintaining their dignity and livelihood." Over the next hour, Singh learned more about Raman's life and work. He discovered that the old potter had been teaching pottery skills to several young people in the neighborhood, passing on traditional knowledge that might otherwise be lost. He learned that Raman often bartered his pots for vegetables with local farmers, creating a small economy that helped several families. "During the monsoon season," Raman explained, "when it's hard for people to find work, I let them help me in the workshop. They learn some pottery skills, and I share whatever money I make from selling the pots they help create." Singh also met Raman's wife, Sita, who was indeed very sick. She suffered from chronic joint pain and needed expensive medicines that the family could barely afford. Despite her illness, she greeted the inspector warmly and thanked him repeatedly for his unexpected kindness. "In all our years," she told Singh, "no official has ever come to our home to help us. They usually only come to demand things or create problems. You are different." By evening, Inspector Singh had a complete picture of the man he had so hastily dismissed from the marketplace. Raman wasn't just a vendor or even just a craftsman. He was a pillar of his community, someone who contributed far more than he took, someone who had maintained his integrity and compassion despite facing constant financial challenges. The next morning, Singh went straight to the municipal office with Raman's application. Using his influence as a police inspector, he was able to expedite the process and get approval for the license within 3 days instead of the usual weeks. He paid all the fees from his own pocket and personally ensured that every document was properly processed. When the license was approved, Singh decided to personally escort Raman back to the marketplace. He wanted to make a public statement that would be clear to everyone, vendors, customers, and other officials alike. On Thursday morning, Inspector Singh's jeep pulled up to the marketplace with Raman and his cart in tow. Word spread quickly that the potter was back, and a small crowd began to gather. Some people looked confused, others seemed pleased, but everyone was curious to see what would happen. Singh helped Raman unload his pots and arrange them in the familiar pattern. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone present, the inspector knelt down and personally helped set up the display. His crisp uniform got dusty and his polished boots picked up clay stains, but he didn't seem to care. "This man," Singh announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "has been granted a proper vendor's license. He is authorized to sell his handcrafted pottery in this location." The story of what Inspector Arjun Singh did for old Raman spread through the marketplace like ripples in a pond. By the end of that first day, everyone in the area had heard about how the strict new inspector had not only helped the potter get his license but had also personally helped him set up his stall and bought pots from him. At first, some people couldn't believe it. "Are you sure it was the same inspector?" asked Mira, the vegetable seller. "The one who was so strict about rules and regulations?" "I saw it with my own eyes," replied Kumari, the flower seller. He knelt down on the ground in his clean uniform and helped arrange the pots. Then he bought 3 of them and said they would remind him of something important. Word spread beyond the marketplace, too. In the tea shops and bus stops, in the small grocery stores and barber shops of the neighborhood, people talked about the police inspector who had shown unexpected kindness to an old potter. Some were skeptical, others were hopeful, but everyone was interested. For Raman, returning to his familiar spot felt like coming home after a long journey. His regular customers welcomed him back with genuine joy. Mrs. Gupta, who had been buying water pots from him for 8 years, hugged him like he was a member of her own family. "I went to 3 different shops looking for a good clay pot," she told him, "but none of them were like yours. The clay was rough, the shape was uneven, and they didn't keep water cool the way your pots do." Throughout that first day back, customers kept coming to Raman's spot with similar stories. They had tried to find clay pots elsewhere but couldn't find anything that matched the quality and craftsmanship of his work. Some had even started using plastic containers, which they didn't like, simply because they couldn't find good clay alternatives. "Your pots are made with love," said an elderly gentleman who bought a large water container. "You can taste the difference in the water, and you can feel the care that went into making each pot." But the impact of Inspector Singh's actions went far beyond just helping one old potter. Other vendors in the marketplace began to see him differently. Instead of the harsh enforcer they had feared, they started to view him as someone who might actually listen to their problems and try to help solve them. Within a week of Raman's return, several other vendors approached Inspector Singh with their own licensing issues. Instead of hiding their problems or running away when they saw him coming, they began to seek him out for guidance. "Sir," said Babu, the shoe repairman, "I've been working here for 15 years, but I don't have proper papers either. Can you help me understand what I need to do?" Singh found himself becoming not just an enforcer of regulations, but also a helper and guide for people trying to navigate the complex licensing system. He spent hours explaining procedures, helping vendors fill out forms, and even accompanying some of them to government offices to ensure they weren't taken advantage of by corrupt clerks or agents. The municipal licensing office began to notice an unusual trend. Applications from street vendors, which had previously been rare and often incomplete, suddenly started arriving in large numbers. Most were properly filled out and accompanied by all necessary documents. The clerks were puzzled until they learned that Inspector Singh was personally helping vendors understand and complete the application process. "In 20 years of working here," said the head clerk, "I've never seen a police officer take such interest in helping people get licenses. Usually they only get involved when there are problems or complaints." Inspector Singh's supervisors also noticed the change. Crime rates in his assigned area began to decrease, even though he was spending less time on traditional enforcement activities. The reason was simple. When people trust the police and see them as helpful rather than threatening, they're more likely to report problems and cooperate with investigations. Singh has created something remarkable in that marketplace. His district superintendent told a colleague, "There's a sense of community cooperation that we rarely see. Vendors look out for each other and for their customers. They report suspicious activities because they trust that Singh will handle things fairly." But perhaps the most significant changes were happening within Inspector Singh himself. The 3 clay pots that sat on his office desk had become more than just decorative items. They were symbols of a new approach to policing that balanced law enforcement with human compassion. Every morning when he arrived at work, Singh would look at those pots and remember the lesson that Raman had taught him. Rules and regulations were important, but they should serve people, not the other way around. A good police officer found ways to help people follow the law while maintaining their dignity and livelihood. This new philosophy began to influence all aspects of Singh's work. When he encountered traffic violations, he started with education rather than fines. When he dealt with minor disputes, he focused on finding solutions that worked for everyone involved, rather than just punishing whoever was technically wrong. Other police officers in the district began to notice Singh's methods and their effectiveness. Some were skeptical at first, but the results were hard to argue with. Singh's area had fewer complaints against police, lower crime rates, and higher levels of community cooperation than anywhere else in the district. "How do you do it?" asked Inspector Sharma, who worked in a neighboring area. "My vendors run away when they see me coming, but yours actually approach you for help." "It's simple," Singh replied, gesturing toward the clay pots on his desk. "I learned to see the person before I see the problem. When people know you're trying to help them succeed rather than catch them failing, they respond very differently." Meanwhile, Raman's life had been transformed by Singh's intervention, but not just in the obvious ways. Yes, he now had a legal license and could work without fear of being shut down. Yes, his income was stable again and he could afford his wife's medicines. But something deeper had changed too. The respect and dignity that Inspector Singh had shown him had restored Raman's sense of self-worth. For years, he had felt like an unwanted relic in a modernizing city, someone whose traditional skills were becoming obsolete. Singh's actions had shown him that his work was still valued, that his contribution to the community was recognized and appreciated. This renewed confidence affected everything Raman did. He began taking on apprentices again, teaching young people the pottery skills he had learned from his father. He started experimenting with new designs, creating decorative pieces alongside his traditional pots and water containers. "Inspector Sahib showed me that traditional doesn't mean outdated," Raman told his wife one evening. "Our old ways can fit into the new world if we adapt them properly." Sita, whose health had improved significantly now that they could afford her medicines regularly, smiled at her husband's renewed enthusiasm. "You're working like a young man again," she said. "That policeman didn't just give you back your license, he gave you back your spirit." The ripple effects continued to spread outward. Customers who had been impressed by Inspector Singh's kindness to Raman began to treat other vendors with more patience and respect. The overall atmosphere in the marketplace became more friendly and cooperative. Young people in the neighborhood started looking at traditional crafts with new interest. If a police inspector could see value in handmade pottery, maybe these old skills were worth learning. 3 teenagers approached Raman asking to learn pottery, not because they needed jobs, but because they wanted to understand their cultural heritage. "My grandfather was a potter too," one of them told Raman, "but I never paid attention to what he was doing. Now I wish I had learned from him before he passed away." Local schools began bringing students to visit Raman's workshop as part of their lessons about traditional crafts. Teachers explained how pottery connected their students to thousands of years of human history and creativity. The children watched in fascination as Raman transformed lumps of clay into useful objects with just his hands and simple tools. "This is real magic," one 8-year-old girl told her teacher after watching Raman work. He makes something from nothing. The media also picked up on the story. A local newspaper reporter heard about Inspector Singh's unusual approach to law enforcement and wrote a feature article titled, "The Policeman Who Sees Hearts, Not Just Rules." The article included interviews with Raman, other vendors, and community members who had been affected by Singh's compassionate approach. The article caught the attention of people in other cities who were dealing with similar issues around street vendors and urban modernization. Some police departments began studying Singh's methods to see if they could be adapted to their own situations. "What Inspector Singh has shown us," wrote the newspaper editor in an opinion piece, "is that progress doesn't have to come at the expense of humanity. We can have organized, law-abiding communities without crushing the spirit of the people who make them vibrant and unique." A year after the incident that had brought them together, Inspector Singh and Raman had developed an unlikely friendship. Singh would often stop by Raman's workshop in the evenings, not on official business, but just to talk and watch the old craftsman work. "You know," Singh told Raman one evening as they sat outside the workshop drinking tea, "that day when I made you leave the marketplace,